I'm going to go ahead and start us off and just kick it off. Thank you for joining everyone for the Brand Innovators Fireside Chat on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm Sylvia Banderas, Coffinet, General Manager of Multicultural Brand Partnerships Marketing at Group 9. My pronouns are she and hers. And I have the great pleasure of moderating today, and our featured speaker is Zeena. Zeena, can we kick off by having you introduce yourself, give us your preferred pronouns, who you are, what you do, and tell us a fun fact about yourself.
Oh, totally. Hi, everybody. Thrilled to be joining today to talk about this really important subject and how it kind of impacts different parts of diversity and inclusion. So thank you for having me. I am Zeena Koda. I oversee all of our brand digital at the North Face. My pronouns are she and her. My fun fact is that in my past life, I was actually a heavy metal DJ on Sirius XM. Still do a little bit of that freelance TV hosting work. Remember when TV hosting work was actually a full-time job at a certain point? MTV, Fuse, shout out those days, but pivoted obviously my career a bit into the space, and just super passionate about connecting the dots with diversity, inclusion. And if anything we learned over the last, few years, my God, I feel like we're in a vortex of time at this point. It really hits a lot of different points that I think you've seen in some of the speakers prior to us. And I'm excited to jump into this. But Sylvia, tell me about one of your facts, your funny facts.
Oh, my fun fact. I studied spiders in Brazil for I thought I was actually going to become an anthropologist, and I'm obsessed with arachnids. Who knew? Anyway.
Terrifying. Terrifying.
It's one of those things people are like, what? But I have to say it was a marvelous time, and spiders have a lot to teach us. They're social creatures. They help each other out. They let other spiders live on their web as long as they clean up after themselves, which really speaks to the big sister in me. So yeah, but very cool. Thank you for sharing that, Zeena. I would definitely never have guessed that. I'd like to ground our conversation today and really bring us down to our most authentic selves. So I'd like to ask you to please tell us what DE&I means to you, and if you wouldn't mind sharing your personal why. This is such hard work. So what keeps you focused, grounded, and resilient?
God, it's such a loaded one to start. I think we discussed this in kind of our prep, but D&I to me is really like creating and being the community that you want to see, especially in your daily work. I think a lot of, the last 2 years, again, has been a cataclysmic, kind of collision of all of these different things that you had never considered, at least in the workplace before, right? And when you pull back and look at, all of the different expectations that were put on employers, on employees, on, even consumers, thinking about what you assess as a valid, a response from a brand. There were so many things that we were challenged with that we had never had to think of for a very long time. So if we're talking about DEI in the workforce, right, it's really being able to take those key considerations. I mean, the last speaker, just even hearing some of the things that the two of them were talking about, you never know what somebody's going through. You never know the battles that they went through. You don't know their history. You don't know their database and their box of knowledge, right? And I think that it's really important as you're considering things, when you're thinking from a brand perspective, through campaigns and just how perception could come off to consumers, how you're living by your values within that work. It really appears not only at the highest levels of the business and making sure that those things are, evangelized at the top levels, but it's literally every day, right? And going through these actions and considering them every day. So I believe that DEI is really a learning process for everybody involved, whether you're an expert or a novice, right? And this is a new area that you're beginning to feel comfortably uncomfortable with, right? These are things that you just have to really assess every day and really insert into your work. And on my personal side, what's really been driving me is I'm very civically and politically engaged, but above and beyond that, I started a nonprofit called Asian American Collective with two other women who were also in the music industry. Prior to coming to the North Face, I was in the music industry for pretty much my entire career on the media side. And we would looked around for years and didn't see other Asian American women, whether it was in rock music or hip hop. So it was a very diverse pool on both sides, but no Asians. and seeing kind of that lack of representation within our community and an area that we love, finding each other was kind of kismet, right? We came together and we created this community, and being able to build and watch and mentor younger Asian Americans that want to be in kind of more fun, creative concentrations, not be a doctor, nurse, or lawyer. Just traditionally when you come from an immigrant background, get to the money. The parents are like, let's get right to the money, right? Like, let's not make my move in vain. Mm-hmm. So as you know, too, because I know that you have a similar background in that way, it was just very important for me to nurture that love. It's just so important for people to explore what being themselves actually means for them personally, and being able to bring that to the Asian American community, especially during the time where, Stop Asian Hate and this whole like racial awakening that we had never stepped into as a collective group, especially not Asian Americans, because it was like, you be quiet and you keep going and you just assimilate as much as possible. That experience has been probably one of the most fulfilling parts of my life personally in the last few years, and giving back and being able to be motivated by seeing people get jobs, be successful within our group, and continuing to grow and mentor and be the representation that I never had growing up. So it's hyper personal to me. What about you, Sylvia?
Oh, that's really rich. For me too, it's very personal. My personal why comes from growing up undocumented. I came to this country when I was 6 years old, undocumented, and I grew up in LA during Pete Wilson. And so I learned very quickly that there were sets and hierarchies of people, and there were people who were meant to be invisible, even if they were right before you, even for their own safety. And I fell into that category. And growing up, seeing and understanding my privilege, because I am white passing, and more so than a lot of the undocumented community could look like. And I think that I experienced this duality of both privilege and marginalization, and it marked me so deeply. So for me, this work is hyper personal. And it's what keeps me grounded, because it is difficult work, and it's day in and day out. And, it's evolving, and it's growing, and it's living, and it's breathing, because it's based on our society and its needs. And with that, my next question to you, and what I'd love for us to explore, is, do you believe that DE&I is a form of social justice?
Oh, absolutely. I think when, obviously we were all sitting in the house for a good 2 years. We're still half in the house as I'm broadcasting live from my house. But, when times were super intense, one thing that I started to consider as somebody who had been born in the digital space, right, and really crafted my career in a time where it was a very key turning point for digital, right? Where people started to use these social outlets for a multitude of reasons, more than just like direct communication. We've all seen this kind of spur and kind of grow into this huge, impactful platform that you would have never considered before. And I think, you hear minor criticisms that people have of people speaking out, and what does a post mean? And is that really enough social justice work? Are you doing it in real life? And, I would catch myself on a very personal level, feeling some kind of way, like, yeah, they're right. But then I started to actually realize during this time, and as we started to incubate in the house and start to build our narratives and really like read, consider, chat, dialogue more about these things, that it is actually social justice. And like, going, actually like evangelizing your thoughts to the world, for a lot of people, that's a huge step. And that's a huge step forward to be able to actually do do dynamic personal work, right? To think through what is it, most of the times people are not putting those things on social media. There's two factions of social media folk, right? Those who are ready to like just be there immediately, and those who are like, I'll post once every 4 months and you may never hear from me for another 6, right? But that ability to kind of dialogue and actually have meaningful conversations, good, bad, and ugly, I think is actually something that I've come to terms with as being a social device to help people engage in conversation and learn more. Now, we've seen it go completely left. The election in the last like four years on that end has been kind of abusive in some odd ways, but I do think that it also like unlocked an ability for people to have more meaningful conversations than just like, passive social conversations. And it allowed people to like at least dip a toe in activism who wouldn't have done it before. So that's kind of a skirt around the question in some ways, but also I do think that DEI work, whether it's internal or external, kind of encompasses the same principles, right? Because you're taking not only what you stand by, whether it's a company or a person, no matter who you are, and evangelizing it to the world, right? Holding yourself accountable through that work, but also the inside can't be rotten. The inside has to actually be structured in the same way. And that is definitely a shade of social justice, right? Because you are doing the work that you want to see in the holistic part of society. Like when you're looking at the larger, quotient, you're seeing that work come to life in a smaller way, but that's life, right? That's what we're doing from a day-to-day basis. So I would say it definitely is. It's important work to actually help push the narrative, push laws, change overarching thoughts. And it's been cool to actually see some of that come to light and to explore other areas that we may have considered in the past. What about you?
You said that so beautifully, and I agree with all of your points. I think it really does raise the question, like what role do companies...
Sorry.
Okay, hi there, pup.
The dog sees my husband and she's like that.
Oh, my dogs do the same thing. All good.
Welcome to work from home.
I know, it's like living at work or working at home, right? Both. I was just about to say that, yes, agree on all fronts. And it really does raise the question of the role that corporations play, what, the corporate responsibility. And we think about what that means nowadays and how consumers are perceiving the role that corporations are playing. And like you mentioned, it's not only an individual purpose, but your values, and that value as a consumer is a value you buy into. And I think consumers more than ever are so aware of what their dollars do and what they support and what they stand for and what they represent. So I hear even the terminology has changed from I buy this product to I support this brand, or I prefer this brand because this brand is sustainable. Or so there is a sense now where these worlds are colliding in the most beautiful way, and corporate responsibility is taking on a whole nother level. And with that, both falling into this category of how DE&I is a social justice movement in many ways. With that, I want to ask you what your thoughts are. Often I hear the question about how is multicultural marketing similar or different than DE&I, or are they two sides of the same coin? How do you express that? And what does that mean to you when you think of DE&I, the philosophy and the practice, and then multicultural marketing and how the two are related?
Oh, this was such a great question when you get it from people. And I've been thinking about it more and more. I think they are two sides of the same coin, but they have to work together, right? Because DE&I really expands past just racial and cultural background, right? There are so many different pieces of enablement that are kind of like ancillary arms to what you need in for consideration for anything, right? And I think that one of the things that I had brought up too is like for instance, Women's History Month or International Women's Day, the scope of who identifies as women has completely changed, right? Obviously you have born women, and then you have people who consider themselves women now. And I think those are some of the things that maybe, 2 or 3 years ago, or even maybe a little deeper, like 5 years ago, would not have been even been on the table for consideration for any mainstream company to really have to evaluate. But I think that those are the nuances that you actually need to think through now. And when you think of like that level of inclusion, that level of diversity in what your slate and your marketing is going to include, it's table stakes at this point, right? Like we need to really be cognizant of those things. And I do think that almost every company has, a responsibility to be thinking through these things and admitting or just like acknowledging when there's an ignorance to it, or, trying to do better. I don't think anybody's going to be perfect, right? And because this is one of the few times, at least in my lifetime, that I feel we're actually learning a revolution together. There's a shade of kindness, right? You need to think through and a little bit of consideration to people's learning curve here, because it definitely is not completely outlined. And I think when you talk about multicultural marketing, I had worked with, when I was working at an agency, I worked with a lot of film clients at the time, and a lot of the film clients have very clear specific marketing down to Black marketing, Asian marketing, Hispanic marketing, LGBTQ marketing. Everything is very specifically boxed because there's also a lot of analysis of who their consumer is and who's digesting content and targeting in a way that we all know from the marketing world, being involved in that, it helps us to hyper target to and understand those audiences. And I think modern multicultural marketing, right, kind of like pins off the heels of that, where you kind of have to be cognizant of who your consumer is in order for you to market the correct way. And if I'm being real, you can't do all things at once, right? Like you have to, every company has the ability to do things, but it has to be very aligned with their values and who they are. And I think when you think about those different pieces, they do come together now. And they do connect in a way that needs to be cognizant of the other. And again, I think that the most meaningful campaigns and the most meaningful marketing and the most meaningful outreach to consumers is when it's really values driven and it feels connected with the ethos of the brand, and it feels connected with what the brand is doing when they're putting their money where their mouth is, when they're making the actions, and also doing them internally. Then all of these things come together and actually feel meaningful versus it just being a face.
Yes, it must be interdependent, all of it. And that's so beautifully said. And with that, I think one of the most interesting things that I've been thinking a lot about and would love your take on this is cancel culture. There's a part of me that cringes. And then there's another part of me that's like, well, it's accountability. I think it's a very complicated subject, one that, this whole session could be about that. But I love your point of view and just thinking, together through what is cancel culture? What is the impact of cancel culture? The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Ooh,
I know it's
I queued up a Harvey Weinstein documentary on Hulu that I was actually going to rewatch because it's been a while since I've watched it. Thinking about cancel culture and just how crazy it's gotten, right, over the last years. I think there's a good and a bad to cancel culture. I think there were a lot of people who were oppressed or abused for a very long time who were not able to really collectively identify with some of those abuses and some of the things that had happened. And as a woman, when I look at the Me Too movement, like, man, I would have never in my life thought that I would see women rising to the occasion and being vocal and being out there with the experiences that they had. So I think there's a good part of it where it doesn't allow people to maintain rotten for long, right? It doesn't allow people to get away with as much as they might have gotten, away with when the internet didn't exist, for instance. There's a lot more receipts these days. And I think that that's something that people collectively need to be aware of as they go into their actions. And that's also something that's kind of comforting, right? That other people are willing to support and engage when it's time, if something's egregiously wrong, right? On the other side of it, I think that cancel culture can be super wild, right? Because people were allowed to make mistakes back in the day, right? And there were many mistakes made, right? Think about if you were a brand and you put out a TV ad during the Super Bowl in maybe the 80s or 90s, right? You invested so much financially into that. If it was a miss, it was a miss and you paid for it, right? And these days, it's really interesting. Like the misses can either be way smaller of a margin or way bigger, depending on how quickly it moves through the internet, right? Where versus back in the day, you'd see it in this one little granular space, and then you're able to move on and kind of move forward. It took a lot more, I think, to really spark people off. So I think cancel culture is really dangerous too, because it doesn't promote education. And it kind of perpetuates some of the negativity, especially online and some of the platforms that like help to perpetuate those things. It kind of perpetuates just this negativity that education is meant to negate, right? Because it's meant to be a dialogue where people are openly able to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. And I fear that cancel culture will also like inflame people on the other sides too. We've seen it happen. We've seen it happen. You think about a year ago with the insurgency and the Capitol and everything that was going on there, it just completely, I was watching another documentary on HBO about that day. And it really reminded me that the intention was real there. The intention was there, but it was really sparked from what is the ugly part, I think, of cancel culture, that like people feel alienated by cancel culture. And we do live in a world where people have different thoughts, right? Whether you agree or not with them, you have to acknowledge that those thoughts are there. So I'm very 50-50 on cancel culture. And I think that it will hopefully, as the world is deflated a little bit, or the fans have come to the flames a bit, hopefully we won't have as much of like a hard line cancel, because I think the education, again, is a really big piece. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on cancel culture, especially, working in the media group.
I like the accountability aspect of it. I just think that it's been misconstrued. Like, I believe that when you have a situation with like a Harvey Weinstein, where there's so much power against what potentially, somebody's life could be destroyed by even the possibility of speaking up. I understand at that level why cancel culture could be useful. But I think when you bring it down to everyday, or a lot of these social conversations that are happening, what's hard about cancel culture for me is that it shuts down conversation. It just puts people into a box, and it's very black and white, and there's no such thing. I think that there are a couple of instances where it is very black and white. There are a few, but for the most part, I believe, like you said, education, communication, humility, these are the basics of DE&I. You can't have even a conversation around what DE&I is if you're not willing to get humble and uncomfortable and listen to the other side. Totally. So cancel culture is sort of the antithesis of that. And so I struggle with that, but I do see how it's useful. And I do see how in some instances, very, very, aggressive instances, it can be the right thing, and it can be a wonderful tool in the toolbox. But I would say it's sort of like a nuclear button. And, you only want to leverage it if you absolutely have to, because I think it's unhealthy in many ways and very alienating. And the more we alienate, the less we come together, and the less we understand each other, and the less we build humility, and the less we build empathy. And all of these things are, the web of what forms DE&I in its basic principles. And so yeah, that's my take. But
well, I agree. I couldn't agree more. I think that, yeah, the nuclear button is a great analogy. There's so much danger to it, and frankly, no one remains canceled that long, right? That's the other ironic part of cancel culture, that it's immediate, like hot button reaction. But I mean, eventually, and we've seen this in the past, right? As long as media has existed and amplified messages, people have been canceled and then come back 20 years later, and you're like, they're on top of the world 20 years later, because you're dealing with a new generation who may not know them. So it does feel more damaging and more reactive than it needs to be at a certain point. And again, I do believe that like the best way to really sit down and understand. And I do think, like, for instance, like, Dave Chappelle and some of these like bigger artists that say maybe off the cuff things that maybe they didn't mean, it was part of a joke or their art or whatever the case. There is a responsibility too, though, on the evangelizing behalf, right? To understand the implications in this day and age of what you say and what you do. And sometimes you got to learn, right? Like sometimes you got to learn that it's not necessarily like that anymore. And I do think that it's a learning curve again for many people. And the best way to do and understand is to sit down and break bread, like a lot of people struggled. I think it was very interesting to see during the height of the BLM movement over the last God, it was over like a year ago now. It's crazy. Again, time is flying. Just to see how many people were like, I don't understand. I never knew this. Like a lot of my white friends and other people who had not necessarily like had to be confronted with a lot of these things. And my number one ask was always like, when's the last time you brought a Black friend to dinner and sat down with them or brought them to your house and talked to them? And there is this whole notion of breaking bread. And I've always grew up in a diverse community with many different people, right? So that to me had never felt foreign. But when you really think about it and you put it on the table, breaking bread together and understanding each other in your private space and having intimate conversations is actually how those changes happen, right? Instead of like, let's cancel this person and that, like, let's talk about these things in a real way, like heart to heart, with a glass of wine, of course.
That always helps.
Yes.
I definitely agree. And I do think that, and this kind of goes into the last question because we're almost at time. And honestly, Zeena, I could talk to you forever. This is so much fun. When we think about a lot of times DE&I, something that I have found, and I'd love your take, is that often the philosophy and the practice don't always come from a place of common sense. Oftentimes, you do have to understand the philosophy in order to be able to practice it correctly. And one of the things that I have found really important as you're trying to build safe spaces and inclusive spaces is this idea of being very blunt about this isn't like something you have to go out of your way to learn it. You have to go out of your way to embrace a philosophy because it's not common sense. For example, in order to do DE&I properly, you would have to seriously embrace conflict, mind for conflict, look for conflict. We're taught for generations in professional settings to avoid conflict, or that conflict is bad. So in that vein, can you share 3 important tips that you'd like to give that maybe are not so common sense that help move your organization forward, the people around you forward, that we can put into, eat those into action?
Oh, totally. I agree. Like sometimes the ideas are great, but in execution, it's definitely tough. I think I kind of alluded to one, and this is something actually I've grown to be very empathetic and understand from like a larger organizational point of view. I think a lot of times, again, people really want a magic button and everything's different and the company works completely differently and they're going to be cognizant of everything, right? And again, a little bit of this fast food culture that we live in, right, makes it feel like it's easy, but actually like structural change, as we can see by the government, is glacial, right? Like it takes a lot of buy-in. It takes years to really get things to the space. And even then, again, it will be different in 10 years culturally, right? So one thing I've really tried to step into and evangelize is that it is our jobs every day to, again, be the kind of change we want to see and step into our power and utilize our voice, right? If there's something you see that's not hitting the mark with you or rubbing you the wrong way because you feel that it could be potentially offensive to somebody, pipe up, pipe up, because it is your power. I just think that it's so important to take those opportunities because so many people don't want to say anything out of fear, but your voice is massively important. And if we're going to, especially me as a minority, right? And, all of us other folks who are minorities who are also in positions of influence, if we're going to make a change, we have to do it by speaking and by sharing our experiences and explaining why, right? So stepping into that power and utilizing that power every day to be influential on the choices that are made is a number one tip for me. Sometimes you expect everything, again, just to change overnight, but it actually happens in those small steps every single day. It's like losing weight, right? It's cutting out those few calories every day. And then eventually you're like, wow, I'm skinny. Great. Also, another thing I would say is when you're trying to assess those kind of plans that you're making, or, you know, to your point, not making it like theoretically great, but actually actionably great. It's really, it's really thinking about how it directly impacts the community. And is there a give back component to the community? Is there a systemic way that you're helping to support that community? And what are those inroads and ways that your public facing actions can actually be helping to change the lives of other people on the back end? I think that that's something a lot of companies struggle with, because again, there is no snap of the fingers. It's very structurally reliant, right? You have to make sure that structure is there. And one thing I could say about the North Face, we have this incredible Explore Fund that's been around for a very long time. And we have a council that we did this year that was super cool, and watching that come to life and kind of like talk about the impacts that it could have in the community. We'll have some cool stuff coming up, so keep an eye on some of the findings that we got. But like seeing that and how those actions impact the community, that's just, to me, when I think about like a way that things have been put together, right? That's the real way, right? It's not a statement online. That is changing the outdoor community from the inside out. And I just love it. And I'm so excited by that work because it really is making that impact. And third thing, lead with kindness and empathy. I would say, like, people are, again, struggling. You don't know their backgrounds. You don't know how hard it could be. And by one conversation and kind of just figuring out how you have more of a meaningful dialogue with your consumers and with other people, I do think that it will help, not only help to change the face of what you're doing, but also like impact your future plans based off of that.
Wow. That is just, I mean, so many wonderful tokens of just advice and nuggets to pick up and put into action. I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the best things about working at Group 9 is that we really do lead with purpose, and we put our ethos into action in everything that we do. And that is a proof point for whether or not your DE&I strategy is working. I think we went over a little bit, but it was hard not to with such
well, you're a great moderator, Sylvia. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
You have so much wisdom to share, Zeena. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much for listening too.